Hi, everybody. Welcome to Kindred Skulls. I'm Matt Freese, and I'm your host today. I'm going to be your solo host on a podcast that we're doing here. Unfortunately, Nick and Greg aren't able to make it this week, but we will power through, and we're going to cover the Bears game for you, and then go over to the 49ers game. So I'm going to get right into it kind of in the week 6 game against the Bears. We'll start on the offensive side of the ball, then we'll move over to the defensive side of the ball. Obviously, overall, a win for the Vikings, which is, a positive thing, I suppose, but it was kind of an ugly win, right? They needed a defensive touchdown. The Bears quarterback, Justin Fields, got hurt during the game. An undrafted free agent from D2 Shepherd came in and, almost led a comeback drive there. It kind of felt like, I think, for a couple minutes for Vikings fans before he ended up throwing an interception to Byron Murphy to seal the game for the Vikings. Another thing about this game, obviously for Minnesota, is that it was their first game without their star wide receiver, Justin Jefferson. He's on IR, expected to miss at least 4 weeks. And that's a pretty major concern for the team. And I think it showed up on the offensive side of the ball, right? Like the passing game wasn't nearly as effective as it had been with Justin Jefferson. And the run game suffered as well, I think, because the Bears were able to load more players into the box and blitz Kirk Cousins more. In the first half of the football game, I guess I thought the Vikings were actually pretty effective, right? They scored 13 points over 3 drives, over 5 drives, I'm sorry. So they had 3 different scoring drives. And while those first 2 drives that were long field goals started out, just after they crossed midfield, they still did cross midfield on those drives. And that's not really a drive that the Vikings had so far this season, right? For the majority of the time, they'd gotten the ball inside the red zone and then they'd either scored a touchdown or fumbled the ball away. I believe that kicker Greg Joseph had only kicked 4 field goals to this point in the season, or maybe it was only 2 field goals to this point in the season. And it's not like he'd missed any kicks prior to this game where he did miss an extra point. So it's just that we weren't attempting field goals at a high rate, and the majority of Joseph's kicks were short, right, prior to this. So the Vikings getting into scoring position and then converting on those long field goal attempts, I think still is a little bit of a positive thing, right? I just pulled it up, and yeah, Joseph had only had a total of 4 field goal attempts prior to this game, in which he attempted 3 field goals. All 3 of his attempts in this game were over 50 yards. His longest one before that was in the 40-plus yard range from Kansas City. The other 3 attempts were in the 20 to 29 yards. So, right, it's the Vikings getting in the red zone, getting a first and goal, and then not being able to convert and end up kicking a field goal besides that. So I don't have too much of an issue with those first couple scoring drives, because it's not like the Vikings have been consistently doing this throughout the season, right? It was kind of unique to this game that they had those drives. And then, of course, right before the half, they go down and score a Jordan Addison touchdown. So that was actually very nice to see before the half, because the Vikings were able to properly execute a 2-minute drill and get down the field and score, which is something I think we hadn't seen from the Vikings prior to this game really all season. And it was something they were very effective at last year. The downside on offense is that they did turn the ball over once in the first half, right? Kirk Cousins had a fumble, I guess, technically. His arm was hit as he was throwing. He didn't release the ball. It went straight into a defender's hands. Even if it was considered a forward pass, it would have been an interception. So at the end of the day, it's a turnover either way. Ultimately, that turnover is on Alexander Mattison, who was unable to protect Kirk long enough for the blitzing linebacker. I do think Kirk had a little bit of a window to get rid of the ball prior to that blitz if he vacates that blitz, but I actually don't mind his decision. He had Jordan Addison, I believe it was, open on a dig on that play, and that's what he was trying to throw in that window. And Tremaine Edmonds, who's the guy who made the fumble recovery, I guess we want to call it, Kirk was manipulating him out of the window, and the only way he was going to be able to make the play on the ball is when it pops up into the air, like it did on this play. So for Mattison, obviously it's a negative play. I'm generally pretty happy with the way Madison's pass protected, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Kirk also had a play which I was astonished did not turn into a fumble. I was shocked when the refs overturned the backwards pass to Cam Akers. Obviously, Kirk was under significant pressure in that play, but you can't panic when you're Kirk Cousins and try to get that ball out backwards inaccurately to a player behind you, because it turns into the fumble. Cam Akers probably should have been able to pick that ball up. You know, football is a difficult thing to recover. I thought he did a good enough job trying to get it out of bounds. And it was really just kind of unlucky that the Bears defender came in and recovered it, or at least so we thought initially. I'm honestly surprised that the refs overturned that play. Like, I saw no video evidence that the Bears player, I forget exactly who it was, did not have the ball, control of the ball in bounds. Like, from the camera angles we could see, I thought he had control of the ball while all of his body parts were still in bounds. Now, it was the very beginning of having control, but it was still control to me. So I was surprised that they overturned that. While I'm on the subject of officiating, I think there's probably one other thing I want to discuss real quick and just get it out of the way. Is like, I was absolutely furious with the refs calling that intentional grounding on Kirk Cousins that was in the third quarter. I just don't understand how you don't see CJ Ham there, or don't know that he's an eligible receiver, or what. There is like absolutely no justification for the refs to have called that. And I think that was really a stain on the refs in all of Sunday's game. Like, I was watching Red Zones, and there were just so many bad calls or bad officiating decisions. It's kind of unfathomable. It's a problem around the league right now. And I didn't have really much of a concern about the reffing after the Kansas City game. There was the missed taking the player taking his helmet off, L'Jarius Sneed taking his helmet off in the Kansas City, that I was frustrated by. But other than that, like, the calls that were questionable that people were bringing into question, I didn't have too much of a problem with overall throughout the game. But then it's just been a consistent thing where, like, refs are making decisions that I just simply don't understand. I really wish they would go to something like the AAF had, you know, where they have that sky judge who comes in and gives an immediate decision. You hear the logic behind the decision, and I think that would really help alleviate a lot of the problems that people have with reffing in the NFL currently. But sorry for that digression. We'll get back to the Vikings game a little bit here. Like I said, I thought the Vikings offense in the first half was pretty solid. I thought Kevin O'Connell drew up some decent plays to get guys the ball, and I thought guys were winning on routes too. Like, they were on a pretty consistent basis early in the game. In the second half, particularly after that turnover, I thought that offense kind of turtled a little bit. Kirk Cousins kind of went into his shell and started checking the ball down in situations where he had deeper plays available to him, which always frustrates me a little bit. That's kind of what Kirk Cousins has been as a quarterback throughout his career. I thought he's done a better job under Kevin O'Connell in particular at avoiding those sorts of things, but it kind of showed up again after the turnover, you know, trying to take care of the ball. So, you know, with the checking down, like, when Kirk wasn't checking down, I thought he was on point in this game, right? There were a number of plays where receivers just dropped the ball where they were open. You had Addison open down the sideline on a deep shot. He wasn't able to bring a diving catch in. You had TJ Hawkinson on a 2nd and 19. I think that was the play immediately after that fumble that got overturned, and remained Vikings ball, was open, isn't able to bring in a diving catch over the middle. You had a KJ Osborne play where I think he won on a corner route and wasn't able to bring in a catch. You had 2 Alex Mattison drops. Like, I'm not sure every single one of those counted as a drop, but they were great throws by Kirk that didn't get rewarded. So that's got to be frustrating from the quarterback's perspective, especially when you're down your best player in Justin Jefferson, that the other guys aren't stepping up. I will say, in credit to those other guys, like, they were getting open on a regular basis, and it's credit to them that they were in those positions to attempt to make those plays. But you have to make those plays once you're there, right? How many ridiculous catches have we seen Justin Jefferson make, or difficult scenarios where he makes a catch through contact? I think you need guys to step up in his absence, right? And there's never going to be a 1-for-1 replacement for Justin Jefferson, but you hope that your other role players, especially, you know, guys you invested a lot of assets in TJ Hawkinson and Jordan Addison, can step up in those situations. So if we flip it over to the run game, because that's been a hot point of discussion on the Vikings this week, you know, everybody wants to bench Alex Mattison for Cam Akers, let Cam Akers get more touches in this offense. Everybody's confused about how the Vikings can have the number 1 run blocking offense, yet our rushing offense is terrible or whatever. And I think there's some good deep things to drill on this that we can have a discussion about here. So the first thing I want to talk about is Alexander Mattison, vision, his pass catching, pass blocking, that sort of thing. I think the main problem that people have with Mattison, right, at this point in time, is that, okay, that I'm going to restart this because I kind of started off on not on the foot that I want. I think Alex Mattison is a player with solid vision, who's a quality pass protector. He makes strong pass protection reads. He doesn't typically miss things. He will get overpowered in instances, but every running back gets overpowered at some point in pass protection. And he's a check down receiver as a receiver, right? He's not going to be an Alvin Kamara or Christian McCaffrey who's going to run great routes and get open and create in space as a player. But I think he does a solid job overall of being an outlet option for the offense. In this game, he had 2 drops. Those are very high visibility plays. I think he's had more drops this year than any sort of rate he's had previously. He's obviously only actually technically fumbled 1 time on offense, but technically is doing a lot of work in that scenario. You know, we had 2 plays that were blown dead that he very much could have fumbled on early in the season. So I think that the view of those fumbles is like people have viewed that he's fumbled a lot more than he has, which I think is a fair criticism of him. The one criticism I've seen consistently that I don't think is fair is his vision. He's had a couple of very high profile missed vision plays, and there were only 2 out of the 18 snaps in this game where I thought he could have done a better job or picked a better hole in terms of his vision. So when you look at it from a holistic perspective, right, 2 out of 18 isn't perfect, but one of those I wouldn't even say was totally his fault. He gained a bunch of yardage in that play. It ended up being called back for a TJ Hawkinson holding, where I don't think Hawkinson did a very good job of blocking the defender who was coming upfield. I think you might have avoided holding if Mattison had cut into the correct hole that he was supposed to, but I'm not fully convinced that you would have avoided that holding on TJ Hawkinson because he hooked the defender pretty bad as he was turning upfield to block him. So on that play specifically, you know, I kind of give Mattison half credit. There was one other play where he followed his lead blockers on a pull play. You had both the center and the guard pulling, and Christian Darrisaw actually got beat to the spot. So that's what I want to bring up, is that the Vikings offensive line in general has done really well. In this game in particular, I thought there were a number of plays where individual players failed that maybe don't usually fail or what have you, right? So you may have a couple plays where Mattison missed the vision, right? You also have at least 2 plays in this game where Darrisaw just completely whiffed on his block, or he had a poor block that led to a tackle in the backfield. On top of that, Ed Ingram missed a couple of pretty high-profile blocks that I saw. Maybe Bradbury was off on 1 or 2. The only one who I can't really ding for at least a couple plays in the run game on this is Brian O'Neill, the right tackle. And then also, I guess Dalton Risner blocked pretty well when he came in. From my eyes. So, you know, across 18 carries, you have 4 or 5 failures from different players, and it leads to Mattison looking pretty bad in the run game, right, in terms of your overall stats. But I didn't think he was making wrong reads or anything, and I think in general this season he hasn't really missed a lot of reads. He's had a couple a game usually, but I think that's pretty standard for running backs across the NFL. So at the end of the day, like, the Vikings made a conscious decision, right, to move on from Dalvin Cook, to move on from a high investment in a running back, and they didn't put any major investment in a running back behind it, right? They brought back Alex Mattison on a cheap contract. So what are you getting out of that cheap contract? You're getting a rushing offense that has the 5th highest success rate in the NFL. And I think it's got good blocking stats from PFF or whatever. But when you look a little bit deeper into that stat, like, the Vikings are the number 1 run blocking offense in the NFL, according to PFF. If you look into their individual game grades, they were in the 50s in both weeks 1 and 2, and the 60s in week 6. So they had high grades the middle 3 weeks when the Vikings run offense, and we've covered this on previous podcasts, was extremely, extremely efficient. Alex Mattison looked pretty good. You didn't have the high volume numbers because they didn't have a ton of carries in those games, but overall that rushing offense looked pretty good in those games. And then you have poor individual games on Mattison's worst games. What does that tell you? It tells you that Mattison is getting basically what you would expect based on the level of blocking from the offensive line. And I think that's relatively true from watching the tape throughout the course of the season. So with all of that said, you know, the Vikings chose to invest little in the running back position. They chose to invest in run blocking in Josh Oliver. They chose to recommit to the offensive line that they have, and it's turned out very well from like overall grading. I'm not going to say that PFF, I'm not going to sit here and say PFF is perfect. I've got a lot of criticisms of PFF and how they grade certain things and how they do things. But I do think that at the end of the day, the Vikings offense is run blocking pretty well this season, and the PFF metrics seem to agree with that. But that's a holistic view, right? If you look to a more granular individual game view, you see misses in this game, and the PFF grades tend to agree with that somehow. So, like, if what I'm seeing on tape is matching what PFF is telling us in terms of the game grades, and then from a Mattison perspective, I'm not seeing a lot of true misses from him on tape where he's missing vision. Obviously, he's not breaking off explosive runs. He's not an exciting player, but I think the Vikings are pretty much getting what they paid for in him, and I think that's a solid enough running game to support a team that primarily wants to be a passing team that has poured a ton of resources into throwing the football, right? We've got a highly paid quarterback in Kirk Cousins. We have the best wide receiver in the NFL in Justin Jefferson. We have a highly paid tight end in TJ Hawkinson, who's a great receiving threat, who we, did a pick swap that included a second round pick for. We have a first round pick in Jordan Addison in the passing game. The Vikings want to be a pass focused team. They invested enough resources to be a serious threat in the run game to help open the passing game. And I think that is overall what has happened for the offense so far this season. And the offense, again, and this is all caveated with the Vikings are turning the ball over way too much, and that is driving down their offensive efficiency, and turning the ball over is the sign of a bad offense, right? So saying the Vikings, when they stop turning the ball over, should just be a great offense is kind of misleading, because it ignores the fact that they're turning the ball over, which is about the worst thing you can do on offense, right? Just excluding that from the conversation is a bad process when you're talking about the offense overall. However, if you want to look at the supporting cast and what they've done, and you want to say, okay, I think that all this fumbling that's going on is kind of a fluke. The Vikings offense has been very good this season, right? It's a top 10 offense by most metrics when you exclude turnovers from all teams. So everybody needs to do a better job of not turning the ball over. That's a fact. That's undeniable. There's not really a way you can get out of that. When they do that, or if they do that, this offense is very good and set up very well, and I think it's got very good play calling. Again, that's difficult to parse, and you can criticize that pretty clearly by saying, well, they continue to turn the ball over, so insofar as that goes, like, you're not going to get out of that argument, right? You can't argue that away because it's the most important thing that an offense can do. But ultimately, it's really hard to say that Justin Jefferson is going to fumble forward out of the end zone, or TJ Hawkinson is going to continue to have fumble issues that he hasn't had throughout his career, right? So if you're looking at the offense holistically, or not holistically, but if you're looking at projecting what you expect the offense to do moving forward, and you dial back the turnovers to kind of a more normal level, I think this Vikings offense actually turns out very, very good at the end of all of this. And that includes the running game that we currently have. I personally wouldn't mind seeing more of Cam Akers, in the running game. I thought he's played well in what he's done. I thought he was a pretty good running back before he came over to the Vikings. But I don't expect Cam Akers to be individually a significant improvement on Alex Mattison. I think they're actually pretty similar types of backs who have good vision, who lack juice at the position. Cam Akers is not really an explosive player by any means. But if he can get the ball, if he can hold on to the ball consistently, right, which is the major problem that Mattison has had so far, and it's a huge caveat, right, when I'm talking about Mattison's game. If Cam Akers can hold on to the ball better, sure, put him in the game. And if he can execute at the same level as Mattison, outside of he also holds on to the ball better, that's awesome, because we still have a good running game, even with the issues that we've had so far. But I think it would make it even better. So that's a very long rant on the run game and kind of the offense in general. I do want to turn it over to the receivers in this game, or the pass catching options in this game, right? All of Addison, KJ Osborne, and TJ Hawkinson had a high profile, we'll call it a drop in this game. I think they weren't necessarily all charted as drops, but they were passes that easily could have been completed. It's hard, right? For Hawkinson in particular, this has been a multiple game funk where he's had these issues. You go back to the Chargers game, we had the fumble and then the interception that killed the game. Last week, he had a couple of drops as well. This week, he adds a drop, right? It's kind of been a funk for him not catching the contested catches at the level that he's used to and dropping the ball more often than he typically does. I think that both of those things, again, kind of like with Mattison, regress back, or with the offensive turnover conversation, regress back, and the team, and he ends up looking a lot better. Like, I don't think that it's a bad contract, or he's not a top 10, not a top 5, tight end anymore. I think he is. I think he regularly does things in games that impress you. There was a one-on-one route he had in the slot against Kyler Gordon, who's a cornerback. He beat Gordon like a drum on that play, gained 10 plus yards after the catch because he wins on a slant as a tight end against an NFL cornerback. That's impressive stuff. He's consistently winning on corners against safeties. He did that against Jaquan Brisker, had a nice long catch in this game as well. I think that was on the drive that led to the touchdown from Addison, right? So Hawkinson is regularly showing you plays where he proves his value as a receiver, and the tough stuff that we see on tape, like the drop or the tough stuff that sticks in our mind, the drops, the missed contested catches, that sort of thing. I don't think is necessarily representative of his game or how he's played so far this season as an overall tight end, right? He's not bad because he's missing one or two of these catches a game. He's actually good for putting himself in that situation, but he does need to ultimately make the catches, right? If he wants to make himself worth his contract. So it's kind of a tough dichotomy where again, like with the turnovers, I don't expect the drops and the missed contested catches to continue at the rate that they have, and I like the other stuff I'm seeing from him. So it's just hard to find a true balance there where you're like, okay, we need to recognize that this stuff is what has happened so far, but it's not what I anticipate happening in the future. Honestly, the next player I want to talk about, KJ Osborne, again, he had a miss as well, but he made a couple of nice, tough catches that converted plays. So I was actually pretty happy with his performance. I didn't think he was going to be able to get open at the level that he did, but there were a number of plays where he was running away from defenders with quality route running in this game that I was impressed with. So that was a good sign for me because he is able to fill in it to Justin Jefferson's shoes a little bit more. And I don't think we're going to necessarily need to rely on Jordan Addison to be the priority receiver as much as I thought we did, as I thought we were going to once Jefferson got hurt. With that being said, I would like to see more designed specifically for Addison on plays, kind of like we do with Justin Jefferson. I'd like to get his speed going across the field on deep overs and stuff. We hit him on a dig in this game, but I think there are more opportunities to do that on overs and use that speed, right? We missed that vertical fade ball, which was a very nice win by Addison. But I just think there's more we can do to put him in situations similar to what we put Justin Jefferson, and I think he will show out when we do that. The Vikings passing numbers were deflated overall because they didn't run a ton of plays in this game, and also because of the drops that they had, right? So nobody really got over 40 or 50 yards receiving in this game, and that, that's not great, right? Like, when we pull it up here, TJ Hawkinson led the team with 50 receiving yards. Osborne had 48 receiving yards and Addison only had 28. But I think there were nice things on tape that either didn't work out because Kirk checked the ball down or because the guys weren't able to catch the balls that were thrown accurately towards them. So I'm hoping that moving forward, they're able to be on the same page and connect more as we proceed down here. So that pretty much covers it for the offensive side of the ball. I kind of rambled on a couple rants there, but hopefully that was cohesive enough. Like, I don't think the Vikings played very well against this Bears defense, which I don't see is very good. But that really is a function of it, and it's hard, right? Because you can't be like, oh, well, individual players or everyone just kind of screwed up once, right? And that led to the Vikings ending up, looking abysmal on offense, particularly for the second half. And Like if every individual person is screwing up once, it's probably a sign that they're going to screw up more in the future, right? But in this game, it really feels like kind of a combination of errors came together and held the Vikings back. I thought there were positive signs from the offense, even if they weren't able to execute on all of that. Now, moving forward to, say, the San Francisco game, I think that's kind of going to be a lot bigger question, right? Because San Francisco has a lot better personnel on the defense, so you're going to be forced into those errors a lot more. I don't have a lot of hope moving forward into that game. But let's flip it over to the defensive side of the ball for the Vikings this game, and they kind of dominated the Bears, right? They got, I believe, 5 sacks total in this game. They forced 2 turnovers. They only allowed the Bears to score 13 points on offense, and they scored a defensive touchdown, right? So net, they really only allowed 6 points if you subtract the touchdown from the Bears total. I think a lot of that, honestly, had to do with the Bears offense being bad. Like this offense is not high quality. I've talked before. Greg and I talked last week when we were previewing this game about the videos that JT O'Sullivan does covering this offense. And, the Bears offense was dysfunctional. They weren't doing things correctly. The first play of the game, to me, is a microcosm of that. Justin Fields is facing a zero blitz, right? The Vikings are running their hawk blitz, right? They've got 6 guys on the line of scrimmage. Everybody else is in off-man coverage. Justin Fields takes a snap. There's a 6-man surface. He has 5 blockers. If all 6 of those guys go, he knows that he has to beat one of them, right? If you have an unblocked player on the line of scrimmage, the quarterback has to beat him by either throwing the ball quickly or by making him miss, right? Justin Fields is probably one of the rare athletes that can make the guy miss, but in this case, it's DJ Wanham, by the way, who's unblocked, right? Justin Fields opens to the opposite side, so Wanham's at his blind side. I don't know what the Bears were thinking because the Vikings run this blitz a ton. Like you can see them do this on tape, getting unblocked guys all the time. Fields needs to get the ball out now. He needs to get it out immediately and throw the ball. The Vikings, hopefully on defense, are going to try to drive on that ball, right? And get a pass breakup or maybe steal an interception or get a short tackle on quick game and make it 2nd and 6 or something like that. Fields just doesn't throw the ball. He has a curl route to that side. He can look at that and throw that ball. He just doesn't throw it, and he ends up taking a terrible sack. The Vikings put the pressure on Fields to make a quick decision in that situation, and he froze up and didn't make the decision. That's bad quarterback play. The Vikings deserve some credit for forcing him into that and recognizing that Fields isn't capable of making those quick decisions at this point in his career and attacking that. Right. But at the end of the day, a quality quarterback, we saw this with Justin Herbert, gets that ball out and it's completed. And that's how he completed 90% of his passes or something like that against us. And overall ended up with a pretty good day. I think outside of that, you see some individual nice performances from the Vikings. And I'm not saying that the Bears offense being bad was the sole reason the Vikings defense looked good in this game, but I think it was a large part of it. The other thing with the Bears that was just unbelievable to me is the number of bad snaps. Cody Whitehair was in there at center most of the game. They substituted Lucas Patrick in, but I counted 6 bad snaps from Cody Whitehair, including 3 in a row, 2 Tyson Bagent on screen throws where the quarterback had to jump up and adjust to the football or went low and Fields dropped one that was low. It was just difficult to get in. That's just unacceptable from the offense, and there's nothing the defense is doing that is hindering the offense in that scenario. Another thing that the Bears were very bad at was the protection calls. There was a clip that went viral of Cody Whitehair turning to the right. He was actually sliding to the right on that. Harrison Phillips flushed Fields out of the pocket in that scenario. I don't remember if that turned into a sack or not, but there was another one where Tevin Jenkins, the left guard, just fell too hard for a stunt, and Wanham, I believe this was Wanham's, maybe it was a pressure, and then Daniil Hunter got the sack on it, but Wanham was just free up the middle, completely unblocked by a bad protection from the offensive line. So the offensive line protection calls were terrible. Overall, it was just a bad day for the Bears offense, particularly in the passing game. At the end of the day, again, the Vikings put a ton of pressure on them with their blitz packages. So I think that the Vikings drove the Bears into some of these mistakes, right? And Brian Flores' aggression should be credited for driving the Bears into some of these issues, right? The previous 2 weeks, the Broncos and the Washington, who are bad defenses in general, weren't able to do anything against the Bears offense. So, there is some level of credit that deserves to be assigned there, but I think this is more the Vikings defense is good at beating up on bad offenses than it is necessarily turning the corner for a Vikings defense and all of a sudden they're a top 10 unit. I do like a lot of what I've seen from the Vikings defense, but I think they're more of a middle of the pack unit, and that's partly due to personnel than anything else at this point. They don't have a quality interior pass rusher. I think that is still a long-term concern for the team. They aren't really comfortable playing man coverage against anybody, right? It's been a lot of off man, and when they don't run their hawk blitz, which plays out like zone, the off man and the hawk blitz plays out like zone, and they play zone instead of man when they're not running hawk. So really, there's some question marks I have about the Vikings offense, especially going against better teams and better quarterbacks in particular. I think we saw issues in the Chiefs game and the Chargers game that were exposed. I don't think that those things are necessarily going to be fixed moving forward from the season now that we had a very, very good game against the Bears team. But I do overall like this Vikings defense. Like, it's a lot more enjoyable to watch than it was last year with Ed Donatel, right? Like, they're being a lot more aggressive, even if we're actually kind of getting a similar result because we're ending up turning to a lot of quick passing. And that turns into something I want to chat about. And part of it was in an article that Arif Hassan came out. It's something that I've brought up a couple times this year, but I wanted to credit Arif for putting the numbers on the Wide Left Substack, which is where he writes on the Vikings blitz. So the Vikings blitz over 50% of the time, right? That's kind of crazy. They end up going, basically the difference between the Vikings blitz rate and second place is equal to the difference between second place and 14th place. So the Vikings are blitzing like 47 or something percent of the time like that. At the end of the day, what's been interesting and what people have noted, particularly with the Chargers game, but I think it applies to the Vikings defense in general, is that the Vikings don't have a high pressure rate despite their absurdly high blitz rate. And a section in Arif's piece really illustrates why the Vikings don't have that high pressure rate, which is why I wanted to bring it up. Opposing quarterbacks get rid of the ball in 2.30 seconds against the Vikings. Against the Giants and Colts, they get rid of it in 2.40 seconds. So that's a full tenth of a second faster against the Vikings. Similarly, the drop off from the Vikings to second place is equal to the drop off from those Colts and Giants to 14th place. However, the Vikings have the lowest average, or they have the third lowest overall average depth of target against them. That's because the Vikings, with their blitz schemes, are forcing their opponents to get the ball out quickly, and they're forcing their opponents to get the ball out short. The Vikings overall are the best team at defending passes behind the line of scrimmage or within 10 yards. So you combine those two categories together, the Vikings are the best team at defending the combination of those two categories. So what the Vikings are as a defense is a team that is attempting to force the quarterback to make a quick decision. Guys like Justin Herbert, guys like Patrick Mahomes, and Baker Mayfield, interestingly in week 1, were great at making quick decisions. They got the ball out. Baker had very little success early on, and I would argue like the Bucs weren't even all that successful overall in that game. They were able to sustain a couple long drives that ended up winning, but if the Vikings don't turn the ball over at the rate that they turned it over in that game, they should have won it, right? So it's kind of a frustrating combination there that ended up losing to the Bucs. The Chargers individually, I thought, did an awesome job, and they probably had the best individual responses. The Chiefs have Patrick Mahomes, so good luck trying to stop that. Those are the 3 losses that the Vikings had, quarterbacks who ended up getting the ball out in 2.3 seconds or earlier. In the 2 wins where the Vikings defense has been dominant, they've allowed 6 total points to the Panthers, 13 total points to the Bears, got defensive touchdowns in both of those games. They've been dominant. Those quarterbacks were not able to get the ball out as quickly, and that's what led to their downfall. So overall, to me, I think that been a very interesting decision by the Vikings to go this route. I mean, it's what Flores has done throughout his career. I think he's dialed up the aggression even further than he was in Miami, but it's kind of forcing opposing offenses to matriculate down the field, right? To go down the field 5 yards at a time, convert a bunch of third downs. And it has worked for the opponents in some cases, but the Vikings in general have been very good at stopping those short passes. So I thought it was interesting to bring up insofar as a team, the Vikings have a very clear philosophy, and we're seeing that play out through the aggression of blitzing, right? What the Vikings are saying is, we are going to dictate to you what you are able to do on offense. And that's kind of a different philosophy from the previous defense, which kind of let opposing offenses do whatever they want to an extent, but also, kind of dictate the terms to the defense, and then you have to have a bunch of checks. The Vikings are forcing opponents into the short passing game, and they're capitalizing on that by stopping their opponents. It's only led to a middle of the pack defense. And there have been some big busts, right? Like, look at the Eagles game for all of the explosive plays that the Eagles got against this defense. That's what happens when you can have high quality receivers and one-on-one coverage against these corners when we blitz heavily. But the Eagles are kind of a rare case where they're one of the most talented rosters in the NFL. So I don't think that's a standard for what you'll see every single week on defense either. If we flip it over to the run defense, this was definitely the Vikings' second worst performance in run defense. It's not really something I'm concerned about long term, I think, for two reasons. One, if you look at the two teams the Vikings have struggled against, right, it's both teams with very mobile running quarterbacks, right? So Jalen Hurts and Justin Fields are probably individually the two best quarterbacks in the rushing game in the NFL. Lamar Jackson's in the top three, right? So they're definitely two of the best three quarterbacks in the run game, and they're two of the teams with the best quarterback designed runs in the NFL. If you look at the way the Vikings defense was playing, I think structurally they create some problems for themselves when they're playing these heavier offenses. We saw it in the Eagles game where they just had too many light bodies in the box and they ended up getting bullied and run all over by the Eagles offensive line. Here, the Bears did something a little bit different, but I think it caused a similar problem for the Vikings. The Bears used a lot of two tight end sets, and Mercedes Lewis in particular was one of the tight ends in those two tight end sets who did a phenomenal job blocking in this game. The Vikings responded with a front where they ran a lot of 5-man fronts in this game. I think they played overall with pretty heavy personnel, and honestly a little bit heavier personnel than I'm used to seeing from them this season, where they would have Bullard, Tonga, and Harrison Phillips in there for most of the game. Obviously Roy got rotated in, but they would have 5 defensive line types, right? So Hunter and Wanham or Davenport on the outside before Davenport got hurt, and then that Bullard, Tonga, Phillips combo on the inside against this Bears offensive line. So that should be a front that's pretty good at stopping the run. In this case, it wasn't, because the way they were aligning that front left Hunter a lot of times as a wide 9 to the 2 tight end side. So there was often a 3-player gap that the Bears could run through. I thought it was pretty interesting that the Vikings decided to respond that way on defense and just let the Bears kind of go through and run through that gap. You would have the 2 tight ends, so I guess it's the C gap and the D gap there, just wide open. I didn't think Jordan Hicks had a great game in run defense. Obviously he recovered the fumble that he returned for a touchdown, and he got the interception as well, right? He got NFC Defensive Player of the Week award from this game, and I thought he was out of position a lot of times on defense, but I could be wrong on that because the Vikings ended up out-gapped in a lot of plays, and they ended up having 2 safeties deep, I thought, quite a bit, and it was a little bit of a surprise to me. So, the Bears run game I thought was pretty effective in this game. I thought they blocked up pretty well against the Vikings, which the Bears have had a pretty good run offense in general, and they've got Justin Fields. So I guess it's not a shocking occurrence, but I didn't think the Bears were going to do much of anything. And I should point out that they had a bright spot in the run game there. So with that being said, I want to turn it over to some individual player performances before I go into a preview of the 49ers game. The first player I want to talk about is DJ Wadham, who I think just kind of had his typical unblocked day against the Bears. There were multiple plays where the Bears decided to just not block DJ Wadham, including that sack on the very first play of the game. And he also had a tackle for loss where it wasn't blocked. So I don't think it's some major coming out party for Wadham. I don't think he's necessarily turning the corner. I really just think the Bears just don't know how to block him, right? Because every other game he's had in the past, he's performed well against them too. And I don't want to mean that to diminish. Like, I thought he had a couple of good reps on one of the Hunter sacks. Honestly, one of them I thought might have earned the sack over Hunter, but it was credited to Hunter. They both kind of hit the quarterback at around the same time, but Wadham flushed him back a little bit. So, it's kind of interesting. He'll be necessary and interesting to monitor as Marcus Davenport went on IR as a player who, we need to kind of step up a little bit here. Andrew Booth Jr. got his really first significant action this season for the Vikings. It really might have played the most snaps he ever had with 20 plus in this game. It was interesting because Mekhi Blackman wasn't hurt and they just decided to put Booth in over Blackman. So that was kind of cool to see. I didn't really have any issue with how he played. I don't think he was tested significantly. I don't think the Bears passing offense did a good job of testing anybody on the Vikings pass defense. Overall, throughout the course of the game, there was one snap where he played too far off. He allowed a third down. The other one where Harrison Smith kind of freelanced on a blitz, initially I thought was on Booth for playing too far off, but he actually did a good job in coverage, covering a vertical route, and then he just cleaned up and made the tackle on, I think it was Cole Kmet, who was wide open out of the flat. It might have been Tunyon. It was one of their tight ends. And then the third player I want to talk about is Danielle Hunter, who I think is having an absolutely dominant season. He has 8 sacks. Interestingly, his pressure numbers aren't really all that high per PFF. I came out with an article on Danielle Hunter for zone coverage, so you can see a little bit more of his tape there, what he's been able to do in the run game, dominating opposing tight ends, closing down lanes, being able to chase down outside zone from the backside, which is just because he's an athletic freak. There was a great play in this game where he chased down Justin Fields to the sideline. Justin Fields, obviously one of the fastest quarterbacks in the NFL. Hunter just absolutely gets on his horse. Fields has a head start on him, and he's not able to outrun Hunter to the sideline. So I thought that was a really impressive play by Hunter and showed his overall athleticism, which really hasn't diminished throughout the injuries that he's had throughout his career either. So that's really been good to see from him. Obviously, he's tied for the league in sacks with TJ Watt. One of the interesting things about Hunter's season is he's got a ton of these sacks, right? Some of them are cleanup sacks. There's not a ton really of individual high quality sacks in there where he's, beating tackles in and getting to the quarterback before he gets the ball out. But there are other play or getting to the quarterback like immediately. It's been some effort sacks and that sort of thing. But the thing is, there are a lot of plays that aren't turning into pressures for Hunter where he does whip the opposing offensive tackle, and it's just that the opposing quarterback got the ball out quickly. Hunter has been a master of winning a pass rush rep and turning the corner at 8 yards this season, which is the landmark you want to hit as a defensive lineman to be able to get to the quarterback. Sometimes when you see a rep of a defensive lineman winning around the edge, it won't actually be a true win because he'll get pushed back to like 10 or 11 yards, right? And it's like, oh, well, he got past his tackle, like he had an angle. Or if the quarterback drifts into that, he might end up getting a sack, but really that's the quarterback's fault and it's not on the tackle, and the tackle didn't necessarily lose the rep. What Hunter does is he is able to flatten out at 8 yards, which is a typical quarterback dropback death, at an absolutely absurd rate. It's been really impressive. He's done it at least once where he's used his unorthodox kind of push-pull move that he goes underneath and then kind of rips through the opposing offensive lineman to get to the quarterback. The problem becomes what I talked about earlier with opposing offenses getting rid of the ball so quickly that Hunter's individual one-on-one wins don't turn into pressures by the charting company because the ball's already out, so they don't chart it as a pressure, even if he won within the 2.5 seconds, or if he would have gotten a pressure if the opposing quarterback had to hold onto the ball past his first read. As a defense, if the quarterback gets the ball out at the top of his drop on every single snap, there's basically nothing you can do about it. It's nearly impossible to get to the quarterback faster than he is able to hit the top of his drop. It pretty much never happens. When you get sacks and when you get pressures is when the quarterback holds onto the ball beyond that time frame, which is why the pressures haven't shown up for Hunter. I think another thing that kind of contributes to Hunter's lack of pressures is the way the Vikings blitz so often. The Hawk blitz in particular is designed to get one player unblocked. In the case earlier, it ended up being DJ Wanham when the opposing offense um, block towards Hunter. A lot of times that's a defensive back like Harrison Smith in his 3-sack game, or, it could be Metellus or whoever that's supposed to be unblocked, because if the opposing offense keeps a tight end or a running back in the formation, you send a defensive back down to the line of scrimmage. They're the least dangerous player to the offense, so they're the player they leave unblocked when they don't have enough players to block everybody. That means that Hunter is kind of a decoy essentially on the play. So he's rushing the passer, right? And he does have a one-on-one, which you kind of hope he wins. But the critical element of that play is the unblocked defensive back who's always going to get to the quarterback faster than somebody who has to get through an opposing offensive lineman to get to the quarterback, right? So I think that adds, pass rush snaps onto Hunter's resume where he doesn't have a realistic chance of getting a pressure, which is why I think his overall pressure rate is lower than some might expect from somebody who I think is playing as well as he is. So it's kind of an interesting dichotomy there that I wanted to go over with Hunter. I'm going to flip it over now to previewing the Monday Night Football game for the Vikings against the San Francisco 49ers. I think the first thing that we have to come up with when we talk about this game is that the 49ers have pretty major injury issues right now. They had 3 of their key players, either go out for the game or miss time against the Cleveland Browns, who they ended up losing to kind of on a last-minute missed field goal in the last game. And that's Christian McCaffrey, Deebo Samuel, and Trent Williams, right? We don't quite know what the injury status is. It sounds like CMC might play. He's questionable at this point. I don't know about Deebo. It sounds like Trent Williams is definitely going to play, or he's on track to play. I think he did finish out that Browns game. So that's just from my impression. Obviously, these are all critical pieces. Trent Williams is probably the best left tackle in the NFL. Deebo Samuel is an awesome weapon, and he's a great complement to Brandon Ayuk, right? He's part of their huge yards after catch team, and CMC is kind of the engine of that offense, right? It's weird these days to talk about a running back as the key piece to an offense, but I really do think Christian McCaffrey is the key piece to that offense, so it'll be a huge change for them with him out. With that being said, Kyle Shanahan has been dialing up plays for guys who we think are nobodies for a very long time, right? And he's pulled together a very efficient and interesting and dynamic offense, even when he's had critical players missing. Brock Purdy, on top of that, has been a very efficient distributor of the football, right? It's certainly not fair to call Brock Purdy a top 5 quarterback. He doesn't do things to the level of a Patrick Mahomes or a Josh Allen or somebody like that. He's been more of a distributor, an efficient distributor of the football, right? He's more on the Kirk Cousins scale of quarterbacks. With that being said, I think Brock Purdy has been great in the Shanahan offense and has been delivering the ball efficiently at a high level. I mean, we've seen that absolutely all season for the 49ers. This last game against the Browns was an exception. What do the Browns have? They have an absolutely phenomenal defense. The Browns defense is probably the best individual unit in the NFL right now. Or it's the best defensive unit in the NFL right now, certainly. They have monsters up front. Myles Garrett is probably the best defensive. He's the best defensive line in the NFL, period. Dalvin Tomlinson, Zadarius Smith have been playing fantastic for the Browns. That kind of stings a little bit for a Vikings fan, but you understand where that came from with the cap space, and they were able to shut down the opposing offense. I think they've got a great cornerback room as well. With the way the Vikings are attacking opposing offenses, right, I've gone into the blitz and what that affects and how that affects opponents. Well, the 49ers have seen one of the other heavy blitz teams in the NFL in the New York Giants so far this year. Apparently, the Giants blitzed, and I haven't watched this tape, but they blitzed 80+% of the time against the Giants and against the 49ers and Brock Purdy earlier in the season, and the 49ers absolutely decimated them. I do think the 49ers have a good way to counter the Vikings blitzes, and Brock Purdy is an efficient enough operator. Like, he's a very efficient operator with the football. So that's what's going to kill the Vikings blitz schemes when the opposing quarterback gets the ball out immediately and they have the playmakers to get open and make stuff happen after the catch, which is exactly what the 49ers have, right? So given the 49ers injury, there is some potential, I think, for the Vikings to work this out. If you make Purdy hesitant because he doesn't trust his weapons, doesn't necessarily trust that they're going to be open or be able to make the plays for him, or if he doesn't trust his offensive line in front of him and he's thinking about creating a little bit more, then he might just be efficiently distributing the football. There is a way with those guys hurt for the Vikings to have a good game on defense, but I'm not necessarily anticipating that that's going to be the case, because I think Purdy will be able to distribute the ball efficiently and operate quickly, unlike a Justin Fields or a Bryce Young. And kind of more like how Justin Herbert played against us, which ended up poorly for the Vikings. Obviously, the run blocking offensive line, or the run game for the 49ers, has always been extremely diverse, and it's always been extremely effective, even without Christian McCaffrey. Back when Elijah Mitchell was the starter, who I believe is going to be back and healthy for this game. If not, they have Jordan Mason. I think the running backs can kind of work interchangeably in kind of pretty much any offense, but particularly the Shanahan offense. The Shanahan family has a long history of getting quality performances out of running backs, right? So I don't have a lot of faith in the Vikings defense in this game against the juggernaut that is the 49ers offense. I don't think that, there's really going to be a ton of room for the Vikings to have an upset win, especially without Justin Jefferson, but it'll kind of be interesting to see how the game proceeds. And if the Vikings are getting home early on the blitz, or they're kind of putting pause to Brock Purdy, and he's not efficiently operating and get the ball out quickly, that could be a turning point for the Vikings. I just don't expect that to be the case. I expect Purdy to operate efficiently and quickly and do a good job as a quarterback in this game. If we flip it over to the other side of the ball, the Vikings struggled on offense last week against the Bears, who don't even have all that great of a defensive line. The Bears did end up blitzing a lot, and I think a lot of the issues were linebackers running through, particularly TJ Edwards, who I thought had a pretty good game. Well, the 49ers not only have an elite defensive line and have a guy like Nick Bosa, who's a game wrecker and one of the best defensive players in the game, but they also have the best individual linebacker in the game in Fred Warner. So the Vikings really aren't in a good spot against the 49ers defense. I think this is another spot where the Vikings run game will struggle because they won't be able to execute to the level against the opposing defensive line. Eric Armstead's in there, Javon Hargrave, who they added as a free agent this offseason. They just have so much talent and depth on this defensive line that I think they are going to be able to win one-on-one matchups against a Vikings offensive line that's playing pretty well so far. Maybe Christian Darrisaw and Brian O'Neill have great games, but I still don't trust the interior of the offensive line, whether that's Dalton Risner, who I thought played pretty well, or Ezra Cleveland, who I think is playing pretty well in general this year. I think it's probably a poor matchup for them because they're not the top players at their position in the NFL, right? So that's going to be a concern. Obviously, it's a concern in the passing game with our ability to protect Kirk Cousins in those situations. It's going to be rough on the against quicker players, or against powerful and quick players, which is a rare combination, but a lot of defensive linemen seem to have that in the NFL, and the 49ers certainly have a guy in Javon Hargrave who can be that. They have other powerful guys. The Vikings interior has historically struggled, right? We saw that in the Eagles game in particular, where they really couldn't block Jalen Carter at all, or other important players on that Eagles defensive line. I think it's probably going to end up being a similar situation for the Vikings here, which is unfortunate on defense. In the run game, Fred Warner is going to clean up anything that gets past that first level. I went on a long rant about how, the Vikings run game isn't that bad. I just don't think they really have the personnel to match up with this 49ers defense and be successful in that scenario. In the passing game, I kind of think there's a little bit of hope. I think Charvarius Ward's a pretty good corner. I think, the secondary is probably the weak spot of the 49ers defense if you're looking at it. But we're talking about like a top 2 defense in the NFL, right? I think the 49ers are the second best defense behind the Cleveland Browns. So without Justin Jefferson, it might be a little bit more difficult for the Vikings to exploit matchups in that secondary. I think that if guys can catch the ball, which isn't something that we've seen from the Vikings offense so far this year, they might stand a fighting chance on offense a little bit, actually. Addison's a quality route runner. I think he'll be able to get open. I think the play calling from the offensive coordinator, right, from Kevin O'Connell, has generally been pretty good and put guys in good spots to get open. They just haven't been executing once they've been delivered the ball by Kirk. So really, for the Vikings to win this game, we need a high-level performance from Kirk Cousins where he's fitting the ball into tight windows and making anticipation throws and making throws down the field, which is something that we saw early on in the Bears game, I thought, and something that we've seen throughout this season, especially, when Justin Jefferson's been healthy. It's a bit more of a question now that he's not healthy if the guys are going to get open and give him that opportunity to make those plays. But I thought there were scenarios where they had that available to them in the Bears game and they just didn't execute. So the next step becomes the offensive players executing. So, there kind of is a script where you can see the Vikings winning in this game, right? It's their receivers on offense are able to get open and make the plays that they need to in the passing game and make the catches that they're supposed to be making. The defense confounds Brock Purdy or gets to Brock Purdy, puts him under pressure, gets his head spinning a little bit if he's off his game without the top weapons that he's had throughout his career as a starter. That's kind of the formula for the Vikings to win this football game. Anything else, and I don't really see them doing it. That's not something I would expect to happen, right? I think Brock Purdy has been an efficient distributor of the football no matter who he's throwing to, so I don't think he'll really miss a beat while missing potentially Christian McCaffrey and Deebo Samuel, and he might not even be missing those guys, right? So that's kind of speculation on my part. On the defensive side of the ball, it's hard to say. Like, I expect the Vikings to bounce back, but we haven't seen them fully bounce back yet. So I don't want to prematurely say, oh, TJ Hawkinson's drop issues, his contested catch issues are over. KJ Osborne's suddenly going to catch every single ball that goes his way. Jordan Addison is going to, step into Justin Jefferson's shoes as a dynamic number one receiver. I don't think that I'm ready to call that until it happens. I think there's a chance that all of those things or one or two of those things might regress back to normal, but it's just hard to predict prior to actually seeing it on the field. So I think that this is going to be a pretty solid win for the 49ers and a disappointing loss for the Vikings once again, dropping to 2-5 after this game if they end up losing it. So not a lot of hope in that breakdown of the 49ers, in this kind of projection for this next game, but that's kind of where the Vikings are at this season, right? Last week we talked about how every ball that bounced the Vikings way last season seems to bounce the opposite way this year, and I think that is kind of true, and I don't want to hope for it to change back to the previous way. So I'm not going to hope for that. I'm going to try to be realistic about what we can see about the 49ers and then come back the week after and maybe play a lot better games against the Packers. And I think it's the Lions immediately after that, or it's another kind of, I guess the Lions are a very good team this year, but it's another kind of middle of the pack team who you're hoping the Vikings can beat rather than, look to overachieve against a team like the 49ers, who's probably the best team in the NFC still to this point. So with that, I'm going to wrap up this episode of the podcast. My name is Matt Freese. You can find me at Fries Football. My co-hosts are Nick Olson at Nick Olson NFL and Gregg Blake at You've Been Gregged. The show is Kindred Skulls. You can find us at Kindred Skulls on Twitter. We're available on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. We also put the show up on YouTube. And Skull Vikings.
Goal, baby.
The first round corner wouldn't do us any harm. Oh, another first round corner wouldn't do us any harm. Oh, another first round corner wouldn't do us any harm. And we'll all cheer on behind, and we'll score.